So, hi everyone. I'd like to welcome Neil McCallion. He is lead software engineer at Rapid7. He likes to promote the creative and experimental side of the web. He has a fondness for cake. And today he is going to outline the tenets of what good and bad mentorship can look like.
Thanks very much.
Take it away.
Applause up front, that's good. Cake is not a euphemism, by the way, I just actually do like cake. I've had a bit too much of it recently. Thanks for coming. I hope you're all having a good day at the talk, at the conference rather. There's no content warnings for this talk today. It's not going to be any loud noises or flashing lights or gore or any of the other stuff I do. This is much more of a serene kind of mentorship conversation. I've been working as a coder and working in this industry in some form for nearly 2 decades. I started quite late, actually. I got my first sort of full-time coding job at age 26. Totally self-taught up to that point, knew nothing. Since then, I've held roles from junior dev up to team lead to department heads. I'm recently back in a full-time dev role after 4.5 years in engineering management. And this has all been done at different scales, from startups in the shared workspace right through to publicly traded multinationals across a bunch of different domains and industries. I know I wouldn't have a career at all without the many people who have kind of mentored and guided me over the years. I won't be naming anyone today specifically, partly out of embarrassment and partly because I'm probably afraid of forgetting someone. But without their patience and their generosity and wisdom, I know I'd have dropped out of the game probably some years ago. So hopefully they know who they are, and if they're watching, thank you. I've been a mentor and a coach to many people myself over the years, and that, along with this talk, is my way of paying my mentors back, or rather paying it forward. This talk submission was kind of rushed, as it tends to be. The title has been kind of nagging at me a little bit because the word mentorship there is doing a lot of heavy lifting. What I actually want to talk about sits at the intersection of, I guess, knowledge sharing, professional growth, networking, management, team building, and other kind of adjacent topics. But if there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk today, it is this. That helping people is good, actually, and you can and should do it. Maybe that should have been the title of the talk, but it's a bit kind of like YouTube clickbait sounding, so I went with this instead. My goal here today is to look at some of the traits and the tenets of an effective partnership in learning and professional growth. A lot of it is through the lens of software engineering, because that's, I guess, where I live in, that's my world. But I hope you'll find it applicable to whatever industry or discipline you're into. A lot has been written about mentorship and coaching, as you can imagine. There are mountains of books and podcasts and courses and different philosophies and systems of thought. There's also a lot of, frankly, rubbish out there. A lot of like LinkedIn lunatic type stuff. There's lots of influencer trash. There's a lot of people out there who are just trying to make a quick buck or stroke their own egos in some way. I'm not going to cite a lot of references today. I'm going to name a couple of primary sources for certain diagrams and kind of theories, but this is very much an opinion piece. It's kind of what I've observed and been taught in my 17 years in the industry. A lot of it's from my own mentors, who've obviously got it from someone else, and so on, and so the cycle repeats. So let's talk a bit about both sides of this mentor-mentee relationship, some kind of foundational ideas and principles to keep in mind, and also some tenets and lessons that will hopefully help you bolster your own learning and growth and help you on the path to being a mentor and or a mentee yourself. So I'm Neil. I'm a staff software engineer at Rapid7, and this is Pay It Forward. So what mentorship is may seem obvious, I guess, but there's some nuances to highlight, particularly in relation to other forms of learning partnership. I define mentorship as an ongoing agreement between two parties. There's the mentee, who wants to learn and grow in some way, and the mentor, who has the knowledge and the experience to help them. The mentorship is dedicated and tailored to the mentee. That's one of kind of the key features of mentorship. It's personalized, it's centered on the mentee's own aspirations and goals, and crucially, it's the mentee who drives these. The mentor helps guide the mentee to their goals by obviously drawing on their own experience and knowledge in a very collaborative and fluid way. So that's kind of my definition of mentorship. These two little pixel art characters I found on itch, I just thought they were cute and threw them in here as representative of the mentor and mentee. It's not making any kind of judgment about like the right person to be a mentee and mentor, regardless of your race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever, your height, your clothing. Anyone could be a mentor or a mentee. These are just representative examples because I thought they looked cute. One of the things I stumbled upon quite a bit and kind of stumble on And one of the good ways to differentiate mentorship is to kind of understand how it differs from another common technique, which is coaching. Because on the surface, they kind of sound quite similar and they're conflated quite often, but they are different in some fundamental ways. I think of this kind of like a spectrum, really. The distinction really is in who drives the process, primarily, how personalized it is, and how much structure is in place around the whole process. And like I said, any individual mentorship situation can be mapped on the spectrum of these two and will often fluctuate. Mentorship always nearly includes a degree of coaching, particularly in tech, where there's going to be skills development and skills learning to be done, and that requires more of a structured approach. But for mentorship, like I said, the mentee drives it, whereas the coach tends to drive coaching more. Personalization for the mentorship aspect is high. It's tailored very specifically to the individual, whereas coaching, while obviously focused on the individual, a lot of the actual structure and process around coaching can be transferred from one person to another without much in the way of like changing. And the structure around it, mentorship tends to be more fluid. We'll get into that a bit more in just a second, but it's very reactive and very much a process that evolves over time. Whereas for coaching, there's inherently more rigidity. There's things like lesson plans, there's training programs, that kind of thing. But like I said, mentorship often includes some elements of coaching alongside it. So let's look at those two roles, mentee and mentor. The mentee, like I said, sets the goals. Obviously, they know what they want to achieve in some sense, or they wouldn't be seeking mentorship in the first place. They're going to be the one coming up and saying, oh, I want to get to the senior dev role, or I want to go freelance, I don't know how, that kind of thing. The goal should be concrete and measurable, right? And a lot has been written about this as well. There should be a win state or some kind of state where you can say you've achieved the outcome. Saying I want to be a better engineer, that's a good aspiration, but it's not really a goal. The mentor can probably help in that case to, identify what the concrete version of that is. It's a good start, and then you need to kind of think of it in terms of like milestones and sub-goals for that. But the mentee is the driver. They're the one providing the impetus here. They know what they struggle with, and they know what their concerns are. It's their role to bring those to the mentor and, get feedback from the mentor about their progress, get help and guidance, that kind of thing. The mentor obviously decides what kind of coaching and experience the mentee will need to grow, but the mentee is the one who pushes things forward primarily. Their goals and needs will determine what the mentor focuses on. The mentee can't say, oh, I need help, and then just kind of sit back and wait for the mentor to lay it kind of all out for them. They're all ultimately responsible for their own learning, first and foremost. And this also applies to keeping track of progress, which we'll get into very shortly as well. Just a quick kind of aside, really, just kind of set a bit of tone. There's lots of different metaphors out there in the kind of, influencer sphere of mentorship, like that kind of seek to encapsulate the idea of mentorship in some way. A lot of them I don't give much credit to. They can be a bit too kind of nebulous and they don't really help very much, a bit too into themselves. I don't think I've ever felt like necessarily a shepherd or a tomato canner or something whenever I've been like acting as a mentor. But there's one I don't mind too much, and that's the idea of mentorship as gardening. It's fairly obvious in some ways. Mentorship is all about growth and change over time, and a garden is a pretty straightforward way to represent that. But I like it because it speaks to the more nurturing aspect of mentorship quite nicely. I guess planting and watering is kind of the equivalent of like imparting ideas and knowledge, and weeding is removing negative attitudes and habits. We also don't need to be in the garden all the time, which is a nice thing to point out. We're not on our hands and knees cutting grass with scissors here. You can tend to it a bit, you can water it a bit, plant something, check back in a little while. I'm actually a terrible gardener in actuality. I mean, this morning I woke up and my garage was flooded because I hadn't properly swept away all like the leaves and debris from last night, and so I was 2 hours late to the conference. And when I put on my so-called gardening gloves and got them wet, they stained my hands yellow, which would have been a great kind of look for on stage today if it hadn't come off. I also have a pollen allergy, and I'm just generally a pretty lazy person, so I'm not particularly good at gardening, but I do like it as an analogy for how a mentor or mentee can kind of develop the latter skills and experience over time. Just kind of something to keep in mind, particularly the notion of it being both nurturing and also kind of a joyous experience when it goes well. One thing I want to highlight here as well is being a mentor is not the preserve of people who are in high positions or who have some kind of like advanced title to their name. Have a think about how career progression generally happens in software engineering. You start as a junior or like an SD1, you've got no real frame of reference for anything, just some kind of theory you've learned, just maybe at school or at uni. Over time, you gain experience and battle scars, and you go up through the levels to senior and lead, principal, whatever. You're shipping huge features, changes to the platform, all kinds of stuff. The different roles on the way there, and their requirements can vary a lot between and even within companies. But when I think of what changes over time as you go through these roles, the main ones are your ability to handle increasing ambiguity, complexity, and scope, and also the breadth and depth of knowledge you can share with others. There's also the part, obviously, about actually delivering value and value over time. That tends to be a function of the other two, in my experience, and it isn't always in your control because of organizational factors. Think about it, as a junior, you're given tasks like, we need to change this logo or this color here by updating this specific file. It's very, what and how. By the time you're at principal level, your asks are becoming things like, we need to, double the customer onboardings by the end of quarter 3, and we don't know what data we're going to have. The ambiguity and the complexity and the scope have all gone up considerably, but you are equal to it by that point because you've gained experience and you can think beyond the minutiae and see the big picture. The thing is, though, the junior can still teach someone something. If I have an SD1 or a junior in my team and they're really good with, material UI, you can bet I'm going to go to them and have them, help me get better at it by kind of mentoring me in it. And the junior should be perfectly comfortable in doing that because they're the one with the knowledge. The best time to teach something to someone is when you've got experience in it, I guess. But the second best time is when you've just got comfortable with it. It's fresh in your minds. You can help get people up to speed. You're aware of any snags you had when you were learning. Why would you wait until you're more senior? You can teach this stuff right now, and you should feel comfortable doing so. So this is Bloom's taxonomy. It's a pretty well-known framework. It's used across education for, devising curriculums and planning assessments and training, that kind of thing. It defines different levels of cognition that can be assessed and tested. The lower band, the blue one, is the ability to recall basic facts and concepts, the sort of thing you memorize answers for. As you move through the bands, the thinking gets more abstract, from memory to analysis to interpretation to actually creation and inspiration. You might be thinking, well, I do all these every day anyway, and often at the same time, and you're right. Bloom's taxonomy is imperfect, and it's often criticized for being kind of flawed along these lines. The main criticism is that the pyramid hierarchy kind of implies that some of these forms of thinking are more valuable than others, and others say that these should be parallel lines rather than some kind of pyramid because that's actually how cognition works in practice. I tend to agree with those criticisms. I draw attention to this particular taxonomy really for the categories themselves. They mirror pretty well, I think, the journey we make through our tech career. From the basic facts and concepts of changing a color in a file to planning and executing features we can't even conceive of yet. We haven't thought of them. We just know there's a problem to solve. But again, there's value in every stage, and every stage can and should be taught once you know how to do it. You can mentor in one or multiple of these, and it all has value. So all that is really to say that you can be a mentor right now. I guess the asterisk next to mentor is to say, at the very least, if not like an actual mentor, you can teach or coach no matter your experience level. You just need to follow, I guess, a few principles and watch out for some pitfalls, which we're going to get to very shortly. So you might be asking, what's in this for me? Hopefully for the mentee, that's relatively obvious. But if you're curious about mentorship and being a mentor, you might rightfully ask, what's the benefit to you? That is perfectly fine. These relationships are inherently transactional in both directions, and your time is the most valuable resource you can give someone. It's finite, it never replenishes. So what's in it for you? On the mentee side, pretty obviously professional growth and career progression, advice tailored to you, and increasing your sort of network of trust around you. The more you get mentored, the more you are able to respond to situations in your team or in your business, whatever. Over on the mentor side, one of the main perks I find is that your existing knowledge, things that you probably know by rote, get reinforced, because there's nothing quite like someone asking you questions and them relying on your answers to actually double check what you know and actually just check, oh yeah, why do we do it that way? So that's a really great perk built into the mentor kind of role. Your own communication and teaching skills kind of go through the roof because you're having to convey complex ideas and training to someone who's effectively a layperson in some ways. Your own career will definitely benefit because certainly as you go up towards like senior and lead roles, being a mentor and being a coach is built into the role. And being able to do it and do it well and do it repeatedly is going to set you in great stead for future promotions and future consideration of things. And on a more kind of, I guess, emotional note, you're investing in the future when you mentor someone. Not just your immediate successors in the company, but the future of the industry. And it's something that itself can be extremely rewarding. You should feel very good about it. Notice that I haven't talked about profit at all here. I'm not going to get into anything about paid mentorship here today. There's a lot of people who are paid mentors. That's actually their business model in some cases. I can't speak to how effective the mentorship is in that case, or how they avoid the obvious conflicts of interest. If you're being paid to assess how close someone is to a goal, for me it's an obvious perverse incentive to not get them to the goal, but maybe it works. But for me, the kind of mentorship that I'm talking about here and the incentives I'm drawn to, and my own experiences, I can't imagine being either paying for mentorship or being a paid mentor. I've been a paid coach for sure, and I've taught people skills, but actual paid mentorship and sort of embodying that role with money changing hands, personally just doesn't align with what I feel is important to me. So you're sold on the idea of becoming a mentor, getting involved, or being a mentee. How do we actually do this? How do I become a mentor or mentee? This, unfortunately, is where kind of the scope of the talk gets a bit limited. In some ways, this is the hardest step. I don't really have much in the way of like concrete go here type answers or do this type answers, because inevitably you need to rely on or extend your own professional and social networks for this stuff. But there are a few things you can do and a few guidelines to follow. I mean, it may sound kind of trite and obvious, but the thing you should do is ask. Make it known that you're looking for a mentor, or that you're looking for mentorship, or you're looking to start entering those partnerships. You can ask in your work Slack or whatever tool you're using, on your social media. There are groups like the NI Slack and NI Game Dev. There are meetups you can attend. Speaking at conferences, by the way, is a great way to do this. If you have a room full of people, you can just say, hey, I'm a mentor, or I'm looking for mentorship, and kind of you've immediately reached them. You don't have to accept the first person that comes along, obviously. You need to kind of spend some time to work with them, but this is something you need to get a feel for, definitely. If you have a manager, you can ask if they know someone who can mentor you. I don't always recommend that the manager becomes a mentor for reasons I'll get into. And if you know someone who's a good fit, just approach them and ask. A couple of days after I submitted this talk to NIDC, before I announced any of it, a colleague in another team in Rapid 7 actually reached out and said, hey, I'm looking to take a next step. I'm looking to make it a senior. I could use some guidance and mentorship. Can you help me? And we'd worked together kind of tangentially for a bit, and he kind of knew my skill set. He knew that I had already embodied the role he wanted to step into. And he just asked, and it was a 20-minute conversation just to kind of get some questions around his goals. I set a few expectations around how we communicate, some principles that we agree on, So we'll take a look at a couple of those tools and what the agreement was. But the conversation happened, and now we're in that kind of relationship together. So what are those kind of core principles? I'll just list them. Mutual trust and respect, an investment of time, effort, and care, fluidity to the arrangement, and transparency, honesty, and accountability, which I guess I would lump together under psychological safety. Trust is key, obviously. There's an inherent power balance in a mentorship. The mentor has more knowledge and experience than the mentee, and the mentee wants to avail of that. The mentee is basically at the mentor's mercy when it comes to what you're actually going to be, what wisdom you're going to impart, even if they're driving the process. And it's easy to see how that can become toxic or unfair if both parties don't establish and maintain that kind of trust and respect. Those things have to be earned, so it's important to spend some time talking and working together before you decide to move forward, but that is really the foundation of this whole thing. An investment, like I said, is what separates mentorship from things like coaching, the investment in the individual. Coaching is invested but isn't tightly tailored to the individual, whereas the investment of time and effort and care in the one-to-one relationship and mentorship can, it's really vital for it to be successful. You have to care, both of you, for it to work. Fluidity just means that we can be adaptive. Like I said, we keep a loose structure. We'll talk more on that shortly. And the last three I've grouped together: transparency, honesty, and accountability. There has to be an agreement that both people will be honest and open in all stages of the process. That can be a hard thing in practice for reasons I'll touch on in just a moment, but if both of you aren't on the same page, or if resentment or fear or even holding back coming into play, it can really just destroy the whole point of mentorship. So there is one tool I like to use to kind of mitigate against that. One of my managers a few years ago shared the book Radical Candor by Kim Scott with me. It's really a management book, but this chart has always stayed with me, and I kind of refer to it often. One axis is how directly you confront a given issue or give a piece of feedback, and the other axis is how empathetic and considerate you are in doing so. Only the top right outcome, radical candor, is desirable, where you personally care and you have directly confronted any issues. Every other quadrant is a perverse effect, and we don't want it. I'll talk in a moment about how things can stray into those quadrants, but this is what I mean by transparency, honesty, and accountability. Feedback in both directions, true, direct, empathetic, no sugarcoating, radical candor. So let's say we've got the foundational principles, we have an agreement on how we're going to work and communicate, mentees set their goals. How do we know it's working? Don't discount the vibes. This is kind of a relationship technically, so if we're practicing those foundations we talked about, mutual respect, transparency, fluidity, we're expected to talk when things just don't kind of feel right, but assuming all is well interpersonally, these are some good kind of questions to be asked at any point to just measure the success of things. Can the mentee do more than they could before? Are they asking the same questions as they were before? How they move towards the goal? And crucially, in my opinion, can they teach what they've learned so far? Those are the foundations and the success indicators of those, and that's kind of like the North Star for mentorship. On both sides, you prefer to limit all stages. I want to close the talk with a very brief touch on, I guess, a bunch of tenets or aphorisms or whatever you want to call them. I've made these observations in both sides of mentorship, as well as being in management. A lot of these lessons I've learned the hard way. They're not in really any kind of order, but they do deepen the meaning of some of the foundations and the other incentives I've talked about. And we'll finally get to the pay it forward part from the title. First one is basically just don't put a bunch of process around this to begin with, especially if you're a management or an engineering manager or you're used to working with things like calendars and task trackers. It's tempting as a mentor to put a bunch of that in play here for the mentee to kind of guide their structured learning. But what you're doing there really is replicating the exact kind of rigidity that mentorship seeks to avoid. We're using Jira and calendars and stuff like that in our everyday jobs. The last thing we want is to have that when we're trying to basically be open, honest, and transparent. Just do some simple note-taking. The mentee should take just maybe a Google Doc or some text file just to track what they're learning. If the mentor does use structured stuff, keep it away from the mentee, and don't get bogged down. Really keep things fluid and adaptable. Pretty straightforward. One thing I've heard a lot from people over the years, I've been in conversations or even in stand-ups where people have prefixed a conversation with something like, sorry if this is a stupid question, but... and I've actually taken them aside and said, don't do this. First of all, there's no stupid questions, or there's very few stupid questions, unless it's one you've asked like 10 times already. And even then, that's more of an indicator that there's a communication problem or the explanation is not there, rather than like an inherently stupid thing. And by framing things that way, you're kind of making yourself out to be someone who can't be trusted or doesn't know what they're doing. You're kind of self-reporting in that way in a negative manner, and perception is reality. This stuff does stick with people. If you're in any kind of problem-solving capacity as a designer, a developer, UX person, PM, whatever, asking questions is the whole point, and that applies to mentorship as well. So, that's the kind of feedback as a mentor you need to give, and just watch for those behaviors, and I guess that's the weeding part. You see someone displaying behaviors that are detrimental to their growth, let them know, give it to them straight, with radical candor, and help them weed it out. And for you yourselves, have a think. Do you say this kind of stuff to yourself, or do you know someone who does? It might be worth just kind of checking that, understanding the motivation behind it, and just kind of changing that behavior. This one's quite a lofty title, The Mentor Should Know the Map. All it really means is that the mentor should really have walked a path that the mentee is intending to, ideally. Cross-domain and cross-discipline mentorship, I'm sure, is possible. But if someone wants to be, if the goal is I want to be a senior JavaScript engineer, then the mentor is best served by being someone who has been or is a senior engineer themselves, right? Because then they actually literally know the steps to take. They can advise the mentee of any pitfalls that are going to be along the way, key skills they need to know, that kind of thing. You can literally be a role model for the mentee, and that includes things like attitudes and behaviors and the soft skills that are required for being in a senior role. And especially when it comes to coaching, if there's going to be hard skills like certain JavaScript libraries or certain design patterns, having relevant domain experience by having walked that path yourself is going to be vital. So that's just really stating a preference for someone who has already done what you want to do, rather than just rely on the first person who says, oh, I can mentor you, it's fine. This plays into what I said earlier about having someone asking you questions and then relying on your answers is a great way to kind of force you to check what you're saying. You need to stay sharp as a mentor and validate what you're saying, because there's so much knowledge we just have by rote, like how we write stuff, the patterns we're using, the tools we're using. It's been that way for so long, sometimes we don't take a minute to stop and think, why are we doing it this way? What is the rationale for this? Is there a better way? And that's one of the great perks for me of being a mentor, personally, is having someone who will force you to challenge those assumptions again. And embracing the why is a vital thing to do just in terms of being a mentor anyway, I think. If you just give someone a rote answer to a question, as in like, here's how you do this, you're just an answer machine then. You're just giving them situational knowledge for that one particular problem. But if you inform them of the context and the why, that becomes a bridge then to independent thinking. If they have the context, they can better understand and reason about similar problems in the future. And it means that they get a broader understanding of the problem. The other thing about checking your assumptions as well is, and this might sound obvious, but it bears repeating, what you're saying as a mentor has to be correct. Like I said, the power dynamic inherent in the relationship means that the mentee is going to likely defer to what you tell them, right? You assume your mentor is going to be correct about things, but you might be wrong. And it's very important to validate those assumptions and correct mistakes if you make them. Otherwise, if all the mentee wants to do is give an answer and get an immediate authoritative response that may or not be complete rubbish, they could just use ChatGPT for that. So try to be someone who validates their answers from primary sources like docs and source code and other people in your department who've done the work, and just that's the responsibility, is to be correct and correct mistakes where they happen. This is a potentially touchy subject. I was not sure whether I was going to put this in, but I'll just touch on it briefly. I've been lucky enough to work with a bunch of great managers and directors who have very much been mentors to me. I've learned a lot from them. A lot of what you see on the slide today came from them. But it's important to note that when there is a power structure in the corporate world, like a HR reporting line, things can suffer in a mentor relationship that way. The transparency and the accountability and honesty can suffer, because at the end of the day, the person that you're reporting to, the person that you're kind of exposing, if you want, your weaknesses to, they're also the person that ultimately decides your professional future, right? Let's say I suck at DevOps, which I kind of do. I would tell my mentor, hey, I need mentorship on how to be a better DevOps engineer. My manager might understand that in the abstract. It's like, okay, Neil's got some development to do on the DevOps side, but if I am articulate and full with him about the exact nature of what I'm missing out on, that can play into things like, he has to go away and mark me on a skills matrix in a couple of months' time. It can affect future work. The very fear of it alone is enough to kind of stymie the relationship. So that, and the fact that managers just aren't always available. They're busy people, and so the accessibility is not there. So definitely embrace mentorship from your manager. Any good manager will have that as part of their skill set, but for your primary mentee, someone who you can really open up to, might be best to look elsewhere. And check your egos at the door. It's just a pride thing, really. I think, especially in influencer land, a lot of people seek mentoring as a gratification or some kind of power trip. That's not what it's about. Do it for the right reasons. And again, when you're giving feedback, embrace that radical candor aspect. It might be tough to hear. You might not want to hear it. You might complain as a mentee. You might feel bad about it. But you've agreed that you're going to be honest and straight. So do so. And these things, these frameworks, these tenets I've described, these are not meant to be constraints. These free you from things like worrying about, oh, I'm going to offend someone or hurt their feelings, or they're going to be mad or whatever. You've made this agreement, you're sticking to it, and as long as you can refer back to that, you'll always be on the right track. And don't get too personal. Strange thing to say, but you have to be in a trusting, mutually respectful relationship. But if you get too close to your mentee, you stray into ruinous empathy territory, as mentioned in the radical candor kind of diagram. You hold back in giving the honest feedback for the reasons mentioned before, and that destroys the very point of mentorship. That can get really toxic. Just if you've got a mentee and they're relying on you for honest, candid feedback, and you are almost shielding them from it, you've completely failed as a mentor. And it works both ways. If the mentee's not giving you what you want, if the mentor's not giving you what you want, the mentee has to speak up. Doesn't matter if they feel they're going to hurt their feelings or not. So stick to the foundations, step back when you need to, and just keep some professional distance to make sure that relationship really works. Pay It Forward is a 2000 movie starring Haley Joel Osment, Helen Hunt, and some guy. I've never seen it. I saw the DVD box in a shop one day, and the concept of paying it forward stuck with me. Basically, when someone does you a good deed, instead of paying them back, you pay it forward to someone else. This has become part of my kind of tenets now. If I'm mentoring someone, the first thing I say to them, if we agree to work together, is if you succeed here, which you will, you have to pay it forward, as in you need to find someone else to be a mentor to, and teach them what you've learned. The best way to show gratitude to a mentor or coach is to become one yourself. We're living in pretty dark times at the minute in a lot of ways. There's a lot of issues socially, economically, a lot of division, a lot of people who have pulled the ladder up behind them, a lot of unkindness in the world, and as trite as it might sound, despite me just being an old nerd slinging JavaScript around and not being a frontline worker or an activist or something, one way to just put a bit more kindness and empathy in the world is to be a mentor and pay it forward, I think, because there's nothing more joyful than when you are mentoring someone and they just get it, or even better, when they have passed on that knowledge to someone else and then that person gets it. You've started a network, you have, made a difference, you've planted a seed, you're tending your garden. So that's all to say, mentorship is good actually, and you can and should do it, just make sure you pay it forward at the end. Thanks to NIDC, thanks everyone for attending, thanks for your time, enjoy the rest of the day. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Neil. What a perceptive, generous talk. I feel like I've been mentored in mentorship.
Do we have any time for questions?
One small question, wafer thin.
It just all landed perfectly, doesn't it? Oh, there's one.
That was an amazing talk. I'm wondering what software stack you used to make that presentation, because it was really well done.
These slides are hand-coded because I'm just like that. They're on CodePen. I see that link up there. You'll find them on CodePen. It's like my own little slide framework and a bunch of stuff going on. I'm on 3 hours sleep. Don't be like me. That's my mentorship advice to you, is don't be like me.
They looked at me.
Any other questions? All right. Cheers, folks. Thank you.
Give it up for Neil.